YouTube channel. So it sounds like we're recording. So Travis, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining me for my presentation on tree identification. I know May is an excellent time to kind of be outside enjoying the evenings this time of year. So again, thank you for taking the time out to come watch this presentation. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to make the trip up to Rockford. It would have been nice to meet everybody in person. However, I do appreciate you allowing me to present via Zoom. I have two small children at home, and they certainly appreciate me being back there to help in the evening and again in the morning. And my wife also appreciates it well. So again, thank you for allowing me to present via Zoom. I'm actually going to turn off my camera because the screen I'm looking at is off to the far left, and it just looks a little weird and distracting to see myself angled like that. So we're going to stop my camera and we'll get right into the presentation. So this is identifying the unknown, practical tips to help you identify woody plants. I found the most Illini looking tree I could to put on the front there. It's actually a 3-flowered maple, Acer triflorum. Unfortunately, it's not native. I probably should have selected one a little more fitting for this group, but nonetheless, it is a nice bright orange fall color to it with an Illini theme. And there we go. We've already went through some of my credentials there, some of my areas of specialty. That photo is sort of an older photo that was pre-pandemic and having 2 kids. So I think I've aged a little bit, maybe time to get a new photo more representative of myself. So we've all encountered unfamiliar plants before. Our curiosity essentially leads us to learn more about them. This session will help with the first step, and that's identifying the unknown tree. That said, 60 minutes really is nowhere near enough time to cover all the ins and outs of tree identification. During my undergrad, I took Dr. Gary Kling's 2-semester course on woody landscape plant identification. And then as I was working on my master's, I TA'd the course with him. That course met a total of 6 hours each week for 2 semesters and went over kind of a systematic approach to identification of trees, shrubs, basically native and introduced species. So there's quite a few there to cover there. But I guess what I'm trying to say there's 45 minutes is really nowhere near enough time to really get in all the details for tree ID. So we're going to help with some useful tools to help you get there. So in limited time limited time that I have, I'm going to start by highlighting some botanical features and terminology used in the identification process. And I'm going to introduce some woody plant identification resources that are available for both beginners and then some that are also available for people with a little more expertise behind them. So, how do you identify a tree for which you have no knowledge of? So let's say this is a tree in your backyard. All you know about it currently is that it's tall, green, was probably planted by maybe a previous homeowner or possibly even wildlife such as a squirrel. You're curious as to what species that tree is. Since you don't know anything about that tree, you need a tool that doesn't require any previous knowledge. And that's where dichotomous keys come in handy. Dichotomous keys are tools used to identify unknown objects or organisms, and you may remember them from something we're back in biology class. Dichotomous keys consist of a series of steps that narrow and lead you to the correct identification of the organism, in this case, a tree. Dichotomous means divided into 2. So each step gives you 2 options. And on a side note, a well-written key has very clear, distinct options or steps in that process. So kind of help avoid getting confused. So as an example here, I've recreated the simple dichotomous key that illustrates how to identify an unknown vertebrate animal. So the first question there, does it have fur? If you answer yes, well, then you have a mammal, and that happens to be my dog, Riley. If you answer no, it goes to a next set of questions, or next question. Does it have feathers? Well, if you answer yes, then you have a bird, which is my bird Artemis. If you answer no, then you go to the next step, which would be, does it have scales? If you answer yes, then you have a reptile. If you answer no, then you have an amphibian. So that's just a very basic example on how a dichotomous key will work. The thing with dichotomous keys is as they become increasingly complex, or they become increasingly complex as the number and species included within the key increases. Basically the questions and choices become more technical in order to differentiate between similar species. While a smaller key may be easier to use, it may not include your specific organism, or in this case, that tree that you're trying to identify. So it's kind of a delicate balance there between ease of use and inclusiveness of all the species you're trying to cover. So while you don't need previous knowledge in order to use that dichotomous key, you may need a good grasp of botanical terminology in order to navigate through some of those larger keys, especially those with species that have a lot of similar characteristics and only minute differences between them. As a result of some of the complexity in some of those, it can be easy to get off track, especially if you select options or choices that you're not 100% sure on. As you get further, you might realize you got off track. You may be able to remember that one step and go back to it, but if there are multiple steps that were kind of tricky to you, it could be very difficult to get back on track. So the advantages, no knowledge required, but disadvantages is they can sometimes be difficult to navigate. We're going to look at some tree ID keys in a few slides. Before we get to them, though, we need to brush up on some of our botanical terminology and actually look at some of the features that are used within them. Having a working knowledge of botanical terminology is always helpful when you are identifying woody plants. The next several slides will cover some of the botanical terminology used to describe various plant features used in many dichotomous keys. If you're looking for an illustrated guide to many of these, many of your keys have some already incorporated in, and I'm going to have one resource at the back of this presentation that's Durr's Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, which has an excellent illustrated glossary for many of these features that are being discussed. And if all else fails, search engines also return several sources with definitions and often with illustrations or even photos included to help you. The orange boxes with blue margins are some of the plant features that are used most often with your ID keys. I've included a few extra there, and they actually kind of have a darker orange margin. It's a little hard to see, but taste, pest, and wood and DNA are not commonly used, but I added them in for more of a random trivia, random fact. When I was going through the woody plant course here at U of I, Dr. Kling mentioned how a long retired Hort professor would actually take a stem and kind of take a little bite out of it and chew it up and somewhat be able to identify that tree based off of its taste. Now, I haven't tried to master that skill, nor do I really plan to. It just, I guess there is a pun intended, but it doesn't look too appetizing to me. Phil Nixon, a retired extension entomologist, would sometimes identify plants just simply based off of the type of insects that he found infesting or inhabiting that particular specimen. And I guess, there are some pests that are fairly host specific, and he could get away with that. Another presentation all in itself is identifying trees by their features within the wood grain. This can be particularly helpful when someone brings you a plant sample with no leaves and no buds, something they cut down last fall, and now they want to know what that piece of wood is. We can, in some cases, look at the grain, get enough details and features down there to narrow it down to a genus or a subgroup of a particular tree type. And then one of the more recent additions to the tree ID field is a DNA analysis. I saw this on a post on a Illinois Extension Horticulture Facebook group. company was offering a service to identify a plant using DNA. Prices started at $100 per sample, so it's very expensive. And then it took about 4 to 6 weeks to process. So I guess I still have a job for a little while. The other features there, again, the ones in blue are the ones most commonly used within our keys and with inside the plant descriptions. Now, to successfully identify a tree, you're going to need a high quality sample with lots of features. The more information or features provided, the better chance you have of correctly identifying that tree. Couple of warnings on that. Be aware that plant features may vary within that same tree and may also vary between same species of different age. So younger juvenile trees can sometimes produce leaves that are significantly different from those from a mature specimen. Also, bark that can sort of be tricky to identify things off of. Bark changes dramatically with age. If you want to compare or want to see what the young bark looks like, simply look up into the canopy on one of the smaller branches there. You'll be able to see what the young bark looks like as well. Buds, we'll get into a lot of detail on some of our bud features in this presentation. Be aware that the resources you're using to identify these are often based off of what buds appear as in dormancy. So kind of those winter months. As they develop during the summer, they're going to have a different size, shape, color than what they will have late fall into late winter. I'll start with a few leaf features, but ultimately what I really want you to focus on is looking beyond the leaves and look particularly at the buds and stems. Leaves are helpful, but they're not always available. As we're coming out of winter, we didn't have them for the last several months, but they're also not very definitive. As I mentioned, they can be quite variable between different plants and even within the same tree. If you have leaves available, they may be able to provide that kind of instant recognition or help you get started in the right direction. But I'd really like to have the group kind of start to focus on some of those bud and stem features as well. But as we look at some of the leaves, one important characteristic, excuse me, sorry. One thing we'll start to look at is different features within the leaf, and that's referred to as leaf morphology, which studies the structural features and parts of the leaf. Some tips for looking at leaves. Again, you want to try to avoid some of the juvenile growth. So if you have sort of a water sprout coming off or any sort of sprouted tissue, a lot of times that has more juvenile characteristics to it and can look dramatically different from some mature leaves that you'd expect to see on a more mature plant. Also be aware that leaves growing in the shade can look different from those growing in a full sun type location. And your identification keys generally use things for more of a full sun type setting. So as you look for leaves to use on your tree ID keys, try to pull one from maybe an outer branch that has that full sun type exposure to it. Now, a very important characteristic with your leaf morphology is something referred to as phyllotaxy, or the leaf arrangement. It describes how the leaves are arranged on a stem. This is often one of the first steps in a tree ID key because it helps eliminate a large number of plant species from consideration. So your leaf and bud characteristics to some extent are divided into 4 categories. Let's see, I'm going to pull up a little laser pointer here. First I have on the list here is alternate, which means there is one leaf or one stem per node, like we have illustrated in the upper right-hand corner. The second one we have is opposite, where we have 2 leaves or 2 stems per node. Following that, we have subopposite arrangement, which is a condition in which the leaves are not spaced far enough apart to be considered alternate, and they're not quite close enough together to be considered opposite as well. And we have that pretty commonly observed in something like our buckthorn species, Rhamnus cathartica. And probably the rarest of all would be our whorled arrangement, where you have multiple leaves coming off from that very close spot, that very close node. And catalpa is our best example, and one of the only trees that we'd encounter with that whorled arrangement. The majority of the woody plants that we're going to encounter have that alternate arrangement. So the vast number, the largest group, are going to be listed as alternate. The second most common would be our opposite plants, followed by subopposite, and then whorled again being the least common of those. So using those, we can again help kind of eliminate some of those from consideration if we know that they're not there. So you may be familiar with the mnemonic device, MAD, horse. It was used to help remember common trees with opposite arrangement. MAD, maple, ash, dogwood, and then the horse was for horse chestnut. And those are some of the most common opposite arranged plants that we have. In our class, Dr. Kling expanded that out slightly. He basically made madcap hip fellow with a princess, which was, and I'll kind of break that down here. The first part was the same. We again have our maples, the Acer species. For ash, he included all the plants in the Oleaceae or olive family. So that would include the ashes, the forsythia, and the lilacs. We still have our dogwoods in the Cornus family. The cap referred to Caprifoliaceae, which includes the beauty bush, our honeysuckles, the Sambucus species, Symphoracarpos, our viburnum, and our weigelas. In this case here, he removed the horse and replaced it with a Hippocastaniaceae, which includes many of our buckeyes. Fellow refers to princess, or not, that's our Amur cork tree, Philodendron, and then the princess refers to the princess tree, Paulownia species. So that was just sort of an expansion of that mnemonic device to include a larger grouping and help the students remember which ones are opposite. That didn't include them all. There's still some others out there that we would encounter. So for example, boxwoods or clematis, hydrangeas, those would all fall under opposite. And then we have a few other sub-opposite plants listed as well. I did want to briefly mention the following leaf features used to describe leaves, but in the interest of time, I won't go into details on these. Again, we want to start to look beyond the leaves and focus more on those buds and stems. But with your leaf features, generally your keys will cover some of their shapes, whether or not they're simple, meaning there's one leaf, or composed, each leaf is by itself, or is it composed of multiple leaflets. It'll talk about how the apex is shaped, or maybe the base of the leaf is shaped, what type of margin it has, and then even how the veins are arranged. Leaves are undeniably helpful when identifying a tree, but we also need to focus on the buds and stems. They're often more distinct than leaves, and they allow you to identify the trees during most of the year. Right now, it's going to be sort of that tricky area where they're just broken, so we don't have buds available for identification this early. They'll start to form, and by fall, we'll be able to use those again through winter. As with other plant features, we can describe buds based on their size, color, shape. So size is sort of an interesting one. There's a relatively large range in what sizes will appear. One of the largest ones that I'm aware of is the umbrella magnolia, which can have a bud upwards of 2 inches long. And we compare that to something like a sugar hackberry, which is as small as 1/8 of an inch. So they can be quite large or very difficult to see in terms of size. Color, it's kind of self-explanatory, a variety of different shapes. Surfaces can have a pretty good range as well. A lot of your references will describe whether or not that bud is pubescent, meaning they covered in lots of short, soft hairs. Are they shiny? Are they very sticky? We'll see that again if the horse chestnut has a very large, sticky bud. And makes for a very easy winter identification. They'll also talk about whether or the angle of which that bud comes off of the stem. So it might have a divergent bud like we have pictured on this upper image in the slide there. That's from a Zelkova, and it's one of the few plants that sort of comes off at a 45-degree angle, which kind of gives you that instant recognition. And then we'll have other species that are very tightly oppressed where that bud goes right up against the stem. One other feature that I do want to quickly point out is actually in the bottom image there. And some plants don't really have a very obvious terminal bud to them. What we're seeing on that one is a hardy rubber tree, and it's sort of a pseudo terminal bud is the recognized one there. There's another smaller bud kind of towards the top there that's not very visible, but it doesn't look like it really has that terminal bud at the end of the stem. A lot of your keys will describe buds based off of their scale arrangements. And a lot of our buds have scales, which are essentially tissues that protect the embryonic tissues within the bud. Imbricate refers to a situation where those scales sort of overlap each other like the shingles on a roof. So we'll see that very commonly on oaks, beech, and in the photo on the left there, the far left there, that's actually of an Ohio buckeye. And you can kind of make out there, if we get the laser pointer out, there's just, again, these overlapping scales, which gives us that imbricate pattern. Another one that's sort of distinctive is something referred to as valvate, where we have two parallel scales that meet without overlapping each other. We'll see that very commonly on dogwoods, alders, and in this photo here of a nannyberry viburnum. And we've got two main scales here, and right down the center is where they're kind of meeting, but not overlapping. Some trees have just a single scale covering that bud. We'll see that on sycamores, and as we have pictured here in this white willow. Others, they don't have any. They're referred to as naked, no scales covering the bud. And in some cases, if you look closely at that, we're going to zoom in there, you can actually make out the beginnings of the leaf tissues. And we'll see sort of just this little veinage start to form in there. You got sort of just a little bit of a hairy surface covering that. But again, no scales, and we'll see that on witch hazels. Black walnuts have the same feature, and in the picture here, that's a wayfaring tree viburnum. Stem features. So moving away from the buds a little further down, the stems can often have plenty of distinct features to them as well. Be aware, color is listed there, but that'll change as the season progresses. So what we have in the middle of the summer, something might be green, as we have of a Japanese linden. It starts out sort of a bright green color, and by the time we reach into fall and winter, it transitions to a maroon red. So that can be variable as well, and those resources are generally going to be off that dormant characteristic. Thickness, they can be fine and stout. You'll sometimes have some trees that have lentisols, like we have pictured. There's an Ordean arrow there pointing there. Just some pores on the leaf surface, but in many cases that might be something that kind of, again, triggers your memory, or if it's in the key there, it'll be described as well. They might be covered in sort of a fine hairy leaf surface or stem surface, which again referred to as pubescence, or they might have a waxy bloom coating them. Odor is a big key that you can use for that. If the basically for some of your plants, what you're going to want to do is scratch that surface of it and take a sniff of that. You don't have to taste it, but get a sniff of that. Some trees have a very unique odor when scratched or bruised. Dr. Kling always reminded his students during the exams, we do some outdoor tree ID quizzes and exams. And if they were stuck, he'd just tell them, scratch it and sniff, because, smells are sometimes things that are the best things to jar your memory and help you identify that. One of my favorite ones is the sweet birch, Betula lenta. If you scratch the stem on that plant, it has a very nice winter green aroma to it. So if you find a sweet birch, try it. It's kind of a surprising when you smell that. Other trees might have some noticeable exfoliation occurring where that bark is peeling off. They might have fissures and cracks, which are essentially cracks on that stem surface. And another feature that you'll often see listed on there is the pith, or the center of that stem. So in that case there, you're going to have to kind of take off a piece of that branch and slice it open with a pocket knife. Take a look at that. Some of them have very distinct color pith. Some of them have separations within the pith that help you with that identification. On the photo there, we have a Kentucky coffee tree, which is well known for its salmon colored internal pith. Other stem features include leaf scars. This is the scar remaining on the stem after the leaf falls off the twig. So it forms that abscission layer, drops off, and some of them can be distinctly shaped. Some of them can be small to large. Those will be listed on those keys as well. And then with inside those, you can sometimes find what's referred to as the vascular bundle traces, essentially where the connective tissues within the leaf had previously attached to that tree. One of the best examples for that I know of is the black gum, Nyssa sylvatica, pictured on the left there. That tree can be relatively difficult to identify in the middle of winter. There's nothing really distinct about the stem or the bud that really jumps out until you look at that leaf scar and you see these 3 vascular bundle traces kind of prominently displayed in there. And that's something that doesn't really come in until fall, when it starts to dry up. Others, in the center there, we again have the Amur cork tree, and it's got a distinctive kind of horseshoe shape to it. Almost looks like a little half football bud coming out of a horseshoe. And then on the right, again, we have a Catalpa speciosa, northern Catalpa, with, it's going to have a whorled arrangement to where those leaf scars are, but also in the center there, there's sort of a circle of the vascular bundle traces there to help you identify it. Last of the features I'm going to look at or share with you this evening are our stem features. An additional stem feature, these are stipules scars, and stipule scars are the remnants of where the stipule was. And stipules are essentially basal appendages of the petioles. They're helpful when they're present, but they generally don't last very long on the plant. They fall off very early in the growing season. So while they're no longer there, there's often going to be that stipule scar that remains. So in the photo, we have a Chinese chestnut, Castanea mollissima. And the left there, we see the stipule. On the right, it's dropped off, but it has left a little bit of a line there, which will help you identify that plant. So those are some of the features that we're looking at, particularly with our bud and stem characteristics. I want to shift gears and mention a few tree identification resources. There are plenty of ID keys available. Hard decision is going to be selecting the one within your comfort zone. So I'm going to give a variety of options here, and you can choose which ones you kind of like and may want to look into using. These resources have been a reliable source for many years. They again vary in some complexity. Some are easy, some are a little more challenging, and vary on basically, they'll vary on the need of your botanical terminology or in order to complete the tree identification. So first on the list is Trees and Shrubs and Vines, a pictorial guide to the ornamental woody plants of the northeastern US, exclusive of conifers. In the book's introduction, I should mention this is by Arthur T. Viertel. In the introduction, he describes his goal of creating a resource for the non-botanist. So his goal right off the bat was not to have something was so complex that only college professors would able to use that book. So as he was trying to approach this, he wanted to make sure there were no lengthy word keys, didn't stress some of the botanical relationships between plants, and he really wanted the leaf drawings to be the primary basis for identification. He does have some additional descriptions in there, but it's primarily provided for supplementary information. I'm starting with this one because you only need a leaf sample to identify with this key. It's easy to use, again, doesn't require that extensive knowledge. And there are a lot of leaf illustrations within this publication, and they're organized by leaf arrangement, simple compound, and then it goes into describing some of the leaf margins. And once you find the appropriate group, you can compare your sample to that illustration and find your identification. It is still available for sale. Again, it's originally published in 1970, but they've been reprinting it, and you can find it on everyone's favorite Amazon or everyone's favorite online bookstore. So we're going to use this key to identify the tree pictured on the left-hand side of the slide. We'll work through the key starting with point A on that key. So as we read A, again, this is a dichotomous key, so we'll read both questions. Leaves variable in length and breadth, but definitely not needle-like or scale-like, sparse, rarely 20 per inch long wings. We compare that to leaves are small, scale-like. We know they're not scale-like or needle-like, so we know already cross that out and go with A. Then we go to step B. You don't have this picture in the picture here, but I happen to know that this plant does have opposite arrangement, so I can skip that alternate step, go straight to the opposite. I can see that it is composed of multiple leaflets. It's got a pollination compound leaf, so I see that it's compound, and it tells me then to move to species 401 through 432. So that's sort of the extent of the words used in this particular key. As we jump to the species section, they had several numbers listed there that we'd have to kind of look through, but we can very quickly, as we get to that very first 401 that they have there, we can match that up to our sample that's provided, and we know that we have an Aesculus glabra, or the Ohio buckeye. Then next step would be to locate species 401 into the back of the book, which would give you a little more information on that particular plant. But again, a very simple key to use, just based off the leaves, and then you're using that visual comparison to confirm your plant. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, the more information you have, the better chance you have to correctly identify that tree. So hopefully the sample you get with has more just leaves, hopefully has some bud and other stem features there. They tend to be a little more distinctive. So in this case, we're going to now be able to identify the plant using not only the leaf, but a bud as well. The second reference that I'm going to share with you tonight is Muncher's Keys to Woody Plants. Forgive me if I pronounce his name wrong. While that previous reference was simple, easy to use, this reference contains nearly double the number of tree species. Thus, it's going to increase its complexity and requirement for the use of extensive botanical terminology. So it's going to be a little more challenging to navigate this one than that first key we had. The book is based off of Walter Muncher's Keys to Woody Plants, which had 6 editions between 1922 and 1950. Edward Cope basically took up the publication and expanded it to include additional cultivated and naturalized species. So the current edition has about 1,100 or so plant species within it. It contains 2 keys, one large key which encompasses all those plants, and then it has a second key, an abridged key that just focuses on those native and naturalized species. So if that's what you're looking for. In contrast to that first reference, this doesn't have any photos or illustrations. So once you've kind of went through that key and you have your plant, you're probably going to need another visual reference to help confirm your identification. And again, this one's also still available for sale. Okay, so again, we have our key here. It's going to be the similar process of a dichotomous key. We're going to identify it using our leaf and bud features. So again, plants with leaf present, we can, since we have a leaf present, we can select A. If you're missing it on this resource, it'll go strictly to a identification using those buds and stems only, and kind of based off of leaf scars. So that'd be for the winter identification. But since we have leaves present, we'll go with that top one. Again, we have broad leaves, opposite or whorled, compound. So it tells us to go to page 21. And we'll start through that key just the same. We have more than 3 leaflets. We know that it's palmately compound, and there again, it tells us right there that we know we have a Aesculus species. Remember that Buckeye family. Next step would be to go back to the species key. So it's moving you in to help you identify what type of Aesculus you have here. Same type of thing. We have a dichotomous key. Looking at that bud, it is definitely not gummy or sticky. So we know it's not the horse chestnut. We know that it is smooth, dry, not gummy, and talks about the leaflets on that leaf having usually 5. So based off of that, we again know that feature. Moving on to step 3 below that, it tells us the buds are elongated, eucrinate, which talks about how the tips kind of come to an abrupt point and has kind of a strong fetid odor. So that's where, again, scratching the stem and getting that scent there can be something that helps you jar your memory, or in this case, helps separate this out from something like the other species provided there. Also, if that strong fetid odor, seeing as I'm an alumnus of the University of Illinois, I'd also like to point out that that is fact and point that Ohio Buckeyes stink. Well, that is their stems, at least. They have that disagreeable odor. Any Ohio State alumni can take comfort in the fact that the Buckeyes football team is far superior than that of the Illinois football program. So that's about as far as my dig can go. Moving on to our next resource. This one's called the Tree Identification Book by George Simmons. It's a good pictorial reference for trees, including evergreens and deciduous. It's mostly going to be native. There's might be a couple naturalized in there, but you're not going to find many landscape introduced plants in this particular book. It uses some high quality black and white pictures of leaves, flowers, fruit, stems, and bark. The author essentially had a photographer, the photographer listed on the cover there, spent a good portion of a year just kind of driving around finding trees and taking high quality pictures and working with the author to find out really what he wanted to have in that book. Like the first one we covered, it's very easy to use and requires little botanical knowledge to navigate it. Still available as well. Continuing with our example that we had with our Ohio Buckeye there, as we look into the first pages of the book, the author actually tells you to start with key 1 and then progress through to key 7. He does not recommend you start with number 7, bark, just because the variability, and it's very difficult to identify in many cases just using the bark. So he recommends starting with key 1, working your way through those keys. And this one here, again, we have that opposite plant. So we can open it up and to the opposite one, the opposite key, and find it there. And I think we're actually on this one, we're on a twig key in the photo there, but we can see our picture here matches that of the Buckeyes. And we then go to 106 to look closer at the Buckeye species. As we get there, again, it has some high resolution black and white photos to help differentiate. There's some descriptions there where it talks about the horse chestnut, again, being sticky, whereas some of the other species, like the sweet Buckeye, is going to be dry, but there's some differentiation in how the scales come to a point. And based off of the pictures and descriptions, we'd identify that as an Ohio Buckeye. If we wanted to also go a little further, we can use the leaves as well as some of the fruits to confirm our identification. And then based off of that, we can again go look and get a little more information on that plant. I believe this is the last one that I have for book-wise, or that I'm going into detail. Woody plants in winter. Being a winter reference, this kind of relies on bud and stem characteristics, though it may include some details on persisting fruits and even some persisting flower tissues that might still be there. Like we had with Muencher's Keys to Woody Plants, this one does require a fair amount of botanical terminology as well. And just a quick look at the inside of that. Again, you see there's a lot of words, not a lot of pictures. So that's where you're going to need that botanical terminology in order to work your way through it. Some things that I was observed, terms are manageable. There are some line drawings as you get past this first keys to genre and get into some of the keys to species. There might be some there to help with your help you ID that plant, but mostly going to be words on that one. Oh, I forgot we do have one more fairly easy one to navigate. And that's Fruit Key and Twig Keys to Trees and Shrubs by William M. Harlow. And this one was last published in 1946. So it's an older one, but it still has a lot of good value for identification. This one covers native deciduous trees and shrubs of the Northeast. And there's going to be 2 keys within this one. The first is a fruit key, which tends to be a little easier to understand and follow compared to the second key, which is using just the twigs. That twig key does require a little more botanical knowledge to navigate. As we look at this one, it uses written descriptions to guide you to the plant's identification. Many of these include some high resolution photos, especially as you get closer to that plant's identification, to help you confirm that you do have, in fact, that correct fruit for that plant that you're trying to identify. There is some potential trouble with this key and identifying the Ohio Buckeye that we've been using. Many people assume that the Buckeye's fruit is a nut. It's actually botanically a capsule. So as you're working your way through this key and you're trying to find a nut, you're going to get a little misled there because it's actually listed inside this reference as a capsule along that way. So that it's not going to be guaranteed that you always get where you're going with these keys. If you're not familiar with some of those botanical terms or even the differences in these plants, you can still run into some trouble. So again, most of these are still available from multiple online retailers, and they continue to be reprinted. I just wanted to throw these 3 up here briefly for you to look at. The one on the left is an excellent resource if you're looking to identify native oak species in our range or region, actually all of Eastern North America. That one's available for free. I got a PDF, which I'm going to share with you guys which lists all these references that I've gone through, including these, and it's going to have a link that you can go and get basically an online PDF of this field guide to native oaks in the Eastern North America. So that's a great one to use. U of I publishes a Forest Trees of Illinois. The book provides a comprehensive overview of almost 150 native and introduced tree species found throughout Illinois. They're presented with their common scientific names, and the details within that book, they include descriptions, talk about the bark, leaves, twigs, buds, fruits, flowers, and even their kind of habit and native range that's occurring in the state there. That one's available on the U of I Extension web store, pubsplus.illinois.edu. And that'd probably be a good one to add to your collection for looking for native trees in Illinois. The last one there is Bark. Sort of an interesting book in that, again, it's trying to identify a tree solely off of the bark tissues, which can be, I find it to be extremely challenging and not one thing that I usually try to attempt. A lot of times I can look at a bark and sort of recognize, yeah, that belongs to a red oak or a black oak, but trying to identify a tree solely based on the bark has always been sort of a challenge for me. But that book is one that aims to do just that. As I kind of work on, I know I'm running a little long on time here. Appreciate you for staying with me. Just the last part of this, I wanted to talk about a couple of things with visual references. So once you've identified your plant, you sometimes will need to compare that to other illustrations or in some cases photos to confirm that you have that identified. One of the books that we use in the landscape industry is Manual of Woody Landscape Plants, written by Michael A. Durr. Extensive coverage of species, lots of excellent high detail line drawings of buds, leaves, stem tissues, and great information on the culture many of these plants require. Not a standalone ID reference. It doesn't have a key to it. You'd have to take a long time thumbing through a lot of pages, comparing those line drawings to a leaf if that was your approach. But that's a pretty solid reference that's used. And you can see there we have our Aesculus species there and some line drawings of the leaves and buds. One thing that's also available for free is the U of I Plants website. This is Dr. Gary Kling's website. And as you go to this, it's going to include a wide variety of landscape species as well as native plants. And it'll kind of generally indicate in there based off of the habitat. So as we look at the website here, we can see habitat. So this Aesculus glaber, Ohio buckeye, native range is anywhere from Pennsylvania to Alabama, Texas to Nebraska. So we know that is one of the more, is one of our native species. Also in that, as you click through this website, he's got a lot of high resolution images on all those plant features that we've talked about so far. And that's something you can compare once you found what you think is the identification of the plant. You can pull up this website, look at the pictures and confirm, in fact, yes, I do have that plant. Last thing I wanted to mention is a fairly new introduction within the last many years, I should say, and that's the use of artificial intelligence to identify plants. A lot of apps have started to pop up out there. I have a list of some that I'll share with the group. PlantSnap is one of the first that I was aware of and tried using. PlantSnap is basically free to use. There are ads on it, and they do limit how many free snaps you have per day. So you can only take so many pictures and have it tell you what it is before you either have to upgrade or potentially pay for it. So it's sort of that freemium software as they refer to it. It identifies flowers, trees, succulent plants, mushrooms, cacti, and more. I've tested it a few times. I was impressed with actually how well it did work. So I took a picture of a a buckthorn, common buckthorn, and it in fact did pop back with Rhamnus cathartica, common buckthorn. Little disconcerted that it's not threatened. I wish it were a little more threatened, and I'm sure many of up in the northern portion of the state would agree that that is a nasty plant that is overtaking the woods. It did have a little trouble with some others, including evergreen. It can sometimes have a little trouble with those as well. And one that I ran into is sort of a not so common plant is it failed to identify a wafer ash. It came back telling me that it was poison ivy. Fortunately, I knew it wasn't because that's my hand in the photo there, and I didn't develop any sort of dermatitis to it. That's actually, as I mentioned, a wafer ash. It's a member of the citrus family, and it's one of the only hosts to the giant swallowtail caterpillar in our region there. So that's my little orange tree I have growing on my patio, and I found this what looked like a bird dropping, and that's sort of its common name for that caterpillar on the leaf. So I didn't really want it to eat my tree, so I simply relocated them down to the wafer ash. I'm going to skip over V tree because we are really running out of time, and I want to leave room for this kind of closing segment of this presentation, a little bit of a story time. And my advice to you, if all else fails, try pie. And you're probably wondering, what am I talking about here? Well, I can honestly say pie helped me identify a plant sample. And the story behind this is, well, let me backtrack. If you've seen Men in Black 3, Agent J travels back in time, basically to help save the world, as usual for many in that series, and he interacts with young Agent K. And when they kind of at a stalled point in their investigation, Agent K says, "We need pie." Well, what do you mean? Well, Agent K's granddad always said, if you have a problem that you can't solve, it helps to get it out of your head. Pie is good, and it did help me. So we had a plant sample dropped off at the U of I plant clinic for identification. This particular person had traveled to a southern state for work, I believe. And on that trip, they came across an interesting tree. They picked up a leaf and a fruit, brought it back, eventually dropped it off at our clinic. Well, by the time I got it, it was sort of partially degraded, not in real good shape to it. We could identify some unique features like arcuate veins on the leaf, and the fruit appeared to be sort of a drupe of kind of a fleshy outer and sort of a hard pit to it. But my colleagues and I were not able to match it to any species that we're familiar with in our area. Well, several weeks later, I took a trip to visit some family in Dallas and sitting in a pie shop. And lo and behold, I think I was sitting actually in this chair right here, and I'm looking up and I see this print, botanical print there. And it perfectly matched the sample that had been brought into our clinic. The arcuate venation, which means the veins on the leaf kind of curve up towards the apex. It had a picture with a fruit that had sort of that soft, fleshy outside and that hard pit to the inside. And I knew instantly that that was the plant that they had brought in. And it's actually of a nutmeg. So I don't feel too guilty about not being familiar with one. It's a tropical species, hardy to zone 10 or 11. So it wouldn't tolerate anything near what we have occurring in Illinois. Okay, with that, I'm just going to leave some of the credits up from the references that I used, and I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
So
I put everybody to sleep.
You can either put your questions in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hey, Travis, this is Linda Ricker.
Hello.
I have a question. Have you ever used the, I think it's called Flora of Illinois as a key for things? It's by Jones.
I don't know that I actually have that one in my collection. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my books here. I've had some of them that were passed down to me. I'd have to look to see if it's in there, but I don't recall ever using that one. Does it lift it by county?
I don't think so, no. I got it when I was in a botany class in, actually it was in Washington, Illinois.
Okay.
That's the key I used 50 years ago when I was in
Yeah.
botany at U of I. So it's a
Thanks, Jerry.
old.
Flora of Illinois. I'm gonna write it down and take a look, see if I can come across it, because I'm always looking. I get a lot of weird plant ID requests from time to time, and the more resources, the better. So
Well, that
Flora
one
of
had a lot
Illinois.
of other stuff besides just the trees. We were
Yeah.
just random plants on the side of the road. So.
So Trevor, this brings back a lot of memories of wandering around campus with John Nelson's tree identification class that I took down there, and very, very fond memories, actually.
Yeah. No, I mean it was one of my favorite classes. You're not stuck in a laboratory or a crowded lecture hall for most of the time. You're actually out there looking and getting your hands on the actual specimen. So I really enjoyed that class. But it's interesting. Some of these keys, they date way back to I think I had one on there from 1920 is when the first edition was published, but they age well.
Travis, this is Janet Geeson. Back in the 70s when I was in college, I took a horticulture class, and one of the requirements was to go out in winter and identify trees just by what you were looking at, talking about the bark, the buds, the lenticels, anything that you could kind of wrap your head around. And I tell you, I had the flu. I was so sick. It was right before the final exam, but I was out there traipsing through the Morton Arboretum, looking at every tree that I could get my hand on, and then went back to class, and then all the stems and twigs were laid out on the tables, and we had to identify them. And it really helps. You just need to get out there and look and make notes.
Well, with the semesters I was TAing especially, I noticed that those first few weeks when all the leaves were there, the students never really looked beyond those leaves. They did that. But then when the frost came and they all semester fell off the tree, they were in a lot of trouble, and they had to do a lot of catching up on some of those bud and stem features to it. But they're incredibly helpful, especially during the winter, which represents a fairly significant length of time here in Illinois, is when you don't have leaves available.
True.
So,
yeah.
Along those lines, Natural Land Institute offers a one-day workshop on twig identification in the wintertime. It's obviously they've had it already this year, but I think it was in January or February of 2022, and we've had 20 or 30 people attend the class, and they get out and do some practice, and it's taught by one of our staff members from Natural Land Institute. So good practice.
Mhm.
So Jerry, is that Edward Cope? Is that the one that we all know?
I don't think so. I saw that too. I'll have to ask him.
Yeah.
Who's related?
I think he was out in New York or Cornell. I have the book right
We
here.
have a local botanist, but he's much younger.
Yeah. The date didn't seem right.
Yeah.
Well, we do have our native tree and shrub sale in the fall. And the main goal for that is just to have a source for native trees and shrubs available. We don't make a lot of money on that sale, but keep your, probably next month, we'll have information starting to come out about that, so.
So I just dropped in the chat box a PDF for some of the resources that I went over, as well as others on that. So if you're looking for, one of my favorites to use frequently is the Oaks of the Eastern United States one. You can get print copies purchased online, but you can also just download the PDF from the website that I provided there. It's a U.S. Forest Service publication, but that's a great resource if you're trying to identify oaks in our area as well.
Janet, can you capture that and so we can put it on the website?
I can also email it to Mark.
That'd probably be good too. Well, if there's no more questions, that was very, very helpful, very informative, Travis.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me. Sorry, it kind of felt a little rushed there and I did go over time. I try to trim a
Okay.
little of this off every time to get it down into that 45 minutes, which is usually asked for, but it's really hard to cover some of that information in a short period of time. But
It's very helpful. We need this kind of botanical lessons from time to time.
so